Next up, I'd like to discuss the possibility of writing as a means of transacting. As you can see here in the top right-hand corner of your screen, we have a sample of an old cuneiform tablet dated to several thousand years ago. As it turns out, writing is in fact one of the essential financial tools that humans developed in order to facilitate not only exchange, but record keeping, as we're going to see over the next couple of lessons when we discuss things like debt and banking. There is indications that humans kept records in order to track numerical quantities, perhaps for exchange purposes, as early as 10 to 20,000 years ago. If you explore the link to the Ashango bone on the slides. Furthermore, we know that the sort of Proto-Sumerians, the people who lived in the region of the Tigris and Euphrates River and the Persian Gulf over the last, roughly starting about 8 to 9,000 BC, began to use little clay figurines to denote different kinds of agricultural commodities, bushels of wheat, containers of honey, jars of oil, etc., and use this to effectively settle up transactions with one another. Now, the first writing, cuneiform, appears in human history at roughly 3300 BCE, which is before current era. So we're looking at about 53 centuries ago at the creating of human writing. At least that's the earliest indications that we've been able to discover to date. And it seems to update this clay symbol keeping. Numbers finally arrive in cuneiform around 3100 BCE, which of course finally renders the figurines obsolete. What's interesting about the notion of cuneiform tablets and writing is that of roughly 90% of the tablets that have been recovered throughout regions of Iraq and Syria are financial records. They contain business records, they contain mathematical homework by students, but overall, a vast majority of what appears to have been written down, transcribed in clay, and then fired into stone is finance, centralizing its importance to the development of writing. We didn't create writing to tell each other stories. We created writing in order to better organize our resources. Now, of course, as we move from small communities with granaries into larger cities, what we see is that temples and palaces begin to emerge as large coordination centers. These coordination centers are administered by literate and numerate elites who effectively try to coordinate the different kinds of economic activity by the various specialists that make up these city-states. By having a central administration of any kind of publicly traded asset, though, something like oil or barley or even something like silver, enables us to conduct transactions by accounting entry rather than physically moving goods around. For instance, if two farmers want to settle up a grain loan between them, I don't have to go to our common granary, withdraw grain, walk it to your house, have you accept it, only to have you then need to transport it back to the granary for deposit. Instead, a simpler technique is for us both to go to the granary, both have them supervise our transaction, note it in a ledger, and simply move the grain from my account to your account, saving us on security and transportation costs. And this, of course, greatly facilitates economies of scale in a number of situations, including agriculture, defense, construction, and others. Now, of course, there are significant advantages to using ledgers. Using a ledger means, of course, that transportation costs fall dramatically. In fact, this was the basis of the Lixichang Piahao in China that was created in Shanxi in 1823. The story goes that the head of a dyeing company was sitting outside his building one day and witnessed caravans of silver, heavily armed caravans moving silver between locations, moving in opposite directions at the same time. And he had the notion that it would be much simpler to net these types of transactions out by ledger rather than moving silver around in a costly fashion. And this actually sets the foundation for the Chinese Piahao system throughout the 19th century. Furthermore, having a ledger and having writing to use as a record of our transactions allows us to engage in dispute resolution and in later centuries, tax calculation based on the value of these transactions. In the modern world, we can analyze the records of these financial transfers to detect things like criminal activity, assess creditworthiness, and other kinds of tasks. This transaction data has actually proven to be remarkably valuable to us. for a number of risk-based and assessment reasons. Finally, it's worth noting that um, writing and facilitates what we call a time-delayed payment or a debt. By writing down what conditions are required for your counterparty to complete a transactions, we can actually break apart transactions over time. And as we're going to see in the next series of videos, that constitutes an enormous number of the transactions that humans actually engage in. Now, of course, ledgers have their own problems. In general, transactions need to be made in the same kind of currency. It's very challenging over a ledger for me to say that I paid you in silver and I exchanged silver for chickens. On the other hand, if we both have silver accounts, then it's relatively simple for me to pay silver by moving it from my account to yours. And if we both have cattle accounts, then we can simply move cattle from my account to your account, or grain from my account to the other. Another challenge with ledgers, of course, is that people have to be both literate and numerate, because at the end of the day, you need to be able to sign or at least verify that a transaction hasn't been committed in a fraudulent manner. Medieval merchants, for instance, in Venice, would only transfer funds on account between parties if both parties were present to witness and sign changes on the ledger in order to prevent disputes from arising in the future. Another problem with ledgers, of course, or another limitation, is that fraudulent accounting in the ledger effectively equates to theft. And that means that trust is essential when it comes to ledger-based transactions. That sort of trust may have underlaid things like Sumerian temples, where everyone believed that the god of the city lived in that stone building. But in the modern world, we tend to have a much less community-oriented view of our ledger-based systems, and therefore trust and verification are absolutely essential to being able to use these types of systems effectively. But even having these types of written ledger-based systems with important regulations in place to prevent accounting fraud, we still see that problems can emerge. For example, North Korean hackers managed to spoof the SWIFT system into releasing $80 million directly to them that should otherwise belonged to the Central Bank of Bangladesh. So it's not that ledgers are impervious to spoofing. The issue is, of course, that no safeguards are perfect. And finally, we have what I like to call the Fight Club problem, which is that the ledger can be destroyed. If we destroy the ledger, then how do we know how much grain belonged to each person? How many cows in the collective herd belong to each person? This can be particularly problematic because it effectively extinguishes any record we have of claims that people might have on one another. When you destroy a ledger that keeps track of the amount of common assets that people have for transacting, it obviously removes people's ability to settle transactions in that way. So in the modern world, we've taken to trying to ensure some redundancy in our ledger-based payment systems. And in that regard, computers have been a huge boon to us and enabled ledgers to come back into fashion in a way that they really had not been able to enjoy in prior centuries.